Well, good evening, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful evening. It's great to be with all of you, as always. Welcome to our webinar, our monthly Buzz webinar, and welcome to the month of May. There is a lot going on in the beekeeping world in this month, and I can't wait to get into all of it with you. If we haven't met, my name is Blake Shook, and I'm one of the owners of the Bee Supply. And it's always great to spend the evening with you guys and talk about what we need to be doing in our bees right now. That's really what we're going to be focusing on tonight. I have, of course, Sherry is with us tonight. She's answering questions in the Q&A box. And then Dodie's with us tonight as well, helping answer all the questions that you guys put into the Q&A box. So thank you to Dodie and thank you to Sherry. Appreciate both of you guys being with us tonight. And let's get started. We've got a lot of great things to cover tonight. So quick update. If you still need some bees, we've still got a couple left. I cannot believe it, but the bee selling season is almost over. I mean, we've got a couple more weeks left of bee pickups, and then it's going to be done for the year. So if you need some bees, you got a couple weeks left to grab some more bees until they are gone. And another thing I wanted to mention, you guys are probably aware of our bee warranty at this point. If you're not, then what you really need to know is that the deadline for signing up is almost here. So if you want to sign up for the bee warranty, the deadline is only a couple of weeks away. So make sure you go onto our website. You can follow that QR code and purchase this bee warranty. And what this will do is if you lose your hive before next year, then we will replace your hive next spring. And if you don't use the warranty, then we'll refund 50% of that warranty cost. So if you've kept bees for any period of time, then you're pretty well aware that losing bees is kind of a part of it. And because we raise all these bees ourselves and there's no middleman, we've got enough of a margin that we can offer bees at a really cheap price in case you lose them. And I don't know if you guys know this, but the survey recently came out for 2023, and our average annual loss rate as an industry was at 48%. So way higher. I think it was at 42 or 43% the previous year. So 2023 was a fairly rough year when it comes to bee loss, and we've kind of been anywhere from 40 to 48% average annual loss rate. So something like this could really help you. Bees are not cheap, as we're all painfully aware, and so this is a great way to safeguard that investment for yourself. Sherry, tell us about our 47th magazine edition.
Crazy, isn't it? I love it.
Crazy.
Love it. Crazy, man. I'll tell you, I love that photo too. We got that photo from one of our instructors, Kim Townsend in Blue Ridge location, where Blake is from and where he is. Love that picture. Just a peek inside the front door. That bee stood there and she said, "Take my picture." Love it. All right. So I'm going to do something a little different for this little overview. We got a plug on Facebook, and I didn't ask the fellow if I could say this, but I know him, so I'm going to say it anyway. His name's Bishop Decker, known him for several years, and he gave us this magazine, a wonderful plug on Facebook today. I think it was today, may have been yesterday, and I just have to read it to you because I can't say it any better, all right? It said, "A very good resource," talking about the magazine, "very good resource beyond classes and learnings, discussions at our monthly meetings is the Bee Supply magazine." In other words, he uses that for their club. He uses the magazine to help teach his club. Wow, blew my mind. He goes on to say, if you're not on the mailing list, I suggest you sign up. It's free and chock full of great advice. And then he talks about what's in there. There's an article on the inevitable spring and summer small hive beetle invasion, unless you get started now to manage. Drawing out new comb, adding supers. New comb, is beekeeper gold. Use of queen excluders, how and where to locate your hives, small hive beetle control, and much more. Thanks, Bishop. I could not have said it better myself. That's what's in the issue. And he's right. You need to sign up for it if you haven't already. It's really and truly, we work really hard to make sure we get the information you need to know for the next month. We get it out at the end of the month for the following month. So there you go. All right, Blake, I'm ready for the next one. So let's see if I can do this as good as Bishop did the other. Well, I picked what's wrong with this hive. And I don't know that any of y'all have ever had a problem with a hive, right? Just us. This one kind of is a little bit of an overview. It picks apart different problems that we're going to run across. And I started off with right now, and you know, I'll kind of feel my pain here. We're running around determining which hives are ready for supers, and in some case adding second supers and on the overachievers, and then some that aren't wanting anything, that's the underachievers. Well, what's wrong with the underachievers? Well, that's where this kind of goes. We talk about identifying low performing hives. Why is this hive different from others? Probably one of our most scratch your head thing. All these hives in one location, they're all doing great except that one. What's wrong with that one? Drifting could be that. As I go on to write about it, I talk about drifting and how location. Sometimes it's just the spot in the earth that hive does not want to be. So think about that. Sometimes just moving a hive will help fix all of the problems. I don't know why that is. Blake may not have that problem, but I guarantee this beekeeper has. Rotating out old comb is talked about in this article. Strengthening the hive with bees. And I've got a video in there, Blake's video of doing that. Adding bees. Sometimes they just need more bees. Feeding weak hives, and then when all else fails, and I won't tell you how that ends. So it's kind of but anyway, go in and read it. It's a good article, and all the other ones that are in this issue, and see if you can't learn a thing or two. Back to you, Blake.
Awesome. Thank you, Sherry. Amazing issue as always. So thanks so much for all you do. Quick little plug for Hive IQ. This is something new we're trying to see how you guys like it, but it's kind of an economy version of the Apame. Apame is phenomenal. We love working with Apame. Highly recommend Apame. But for a lot of our customers, the Apame Hive is a little bit cost prohibitive. And so, but they still want all the benefits that come with having an insulated, especially in the summers in the south where it's really hot, or further north where it's really cold in the winters. That extra R value can just make your hive not work as hard to keep their hive cool or warm. I always tell people insulated hives are a great luxury for the bees. It makes them not have to work as hard. It's not going to solve varroa mites or queenless issues or all the other things we face in beekeeping. So you can't get an insulated hive and not pay attention to your bees anymore. Kind of like a flow hive, right? You can't just get a flow hive and say, oh, I guess I'm good to go. No, it just makes one aspect of beekeeping a little easier or a little better. And so Hive IQ is the same way. It's great. I recommend it. It can be helpful. Hive IQ is just a little cheaper than the Apame. Quick little thing here. So if you guys, I know a lot of you are listening from all across the country, but a lot of you are also listening from Texas. And this is a little video I saw today. Whoops, where'd it go? See if I can mute it. This was Livingston, Texas. So if you're in Southeast Texas, there is a lot of flooding going on right now. We had to close our store in Southeast Texas, our Dayton store. We had to shut it down today because the employees and our manager, Paul, called and said, hey, like if we don't leave right now, I don't think we're going to be able to leave because all the roads are so flooded. And so we had to shut the store down. We were without power anyway. They had to move all the hives to higher ground and kind of get out. And hopefully the water will be receded enough and they can they're planning on being back and doing bee pickups tomorrow. But it's kind of a mess if you're in Southeast Texas right now. What impact does that have on your bees? This is not in Southeast Texas, but these are some hives that I had flood in California last year. And, the impact of flooded hives, hopefully you never have this happen, but it's not terribly uncommon when you have one of those huge floods that your beehives are impacted. If it's like this, these bees were actually perfectly fine. Even the woodenware was fine. There was plenty of room up in the upper boxes and, there was zero damage. Now, what you really have to watch out for, and where this is really risky, because 7 or 8 years ago now, I had a bee or in Southeast Texas, kind of rains a lot there along the Gulf Coast. And it was a really healthy yard of bees. I had about 100 hives in it. And we went through, we put honey supers on everything. Everything looked really healthy. Came back home to North Texas where I live and went back about 2 weeks later. And this one particular yard, all the bees were dead. Inside the hive, the bees were all dead. And like every single one of them. I thought, what on earth happened? Like, was it a spray kill? Like, even sprays don't usually kill 100% of the bees, but like every bee in every hive was dead. And some of them had supers full of honey, 10, 15 frames of brood. And I thought, well, maybe they flooded, but there wasn't water damage. We had gotten a huge rain, for about a 6-inch rain. But if it's a flood, oftentimes it sweeps the bees away, and we didn't see any flood damage in the yard. Finally, what we realized has happened, because we saw a water line just right above the entrance, kind of like what you see right here on these hives. Well, what had happened is the bees suffocated. So it had rained a ton. The water rose about to this height, like you can see on this picture, and it sealed off the entrance. Then the sun came out, it got hot, and the bees couldn't ventilate the hive because the entrance was sealed with water, and they all suffocated. And so if you're concerned about a flood, it sounds counterintuitive, but if your bees get to this situation, what you really need to do is crack the lid open so that the bees can actually ventilate the hive. And if you have a telescoping cover, maybe stick a popsicle stick between the inner cover and the box, so that there's just a 1-inch crack or so bees can come out, they can ventilate the hive and keep it cool, because they can certainly suffocate quickly if it's a good strong hive and that water covers up the entrance. So if the hive, if the water's up over the top of the box, unfortunately there's not much you can do. You can try to save the comb, but it'll certainly, it'll kill the bees. Beehives do float, so I've seen many instances where hives are floating down the river or floating away. I've actually had beehives kind of float away, and I found them 3 or 4 days later stuck in a river, on the edge of a river, and a lot of the bees were actually still alive. So it is amazing. Don't give up. If your bees floated away, they might actually still be able to be preserved. So anyway, with that cheery note, keep your beekeeping friends in the Southeast Texas in mind. Hopefully there aren't too many that have had flood damage, but it's certainly something to keep in mind as you go through your beekeeping journey. So let's jump out into the bee yard and see what is going on, and then we'll come back to the classroom to continue. So here is our bee yard session.
Hey friends, Blake Shook with the Bee Supply here. Let's talk about something that's on all of our minds as we go into the late spring months, and that's how do we maximize honey production? So if you're a brand new beekeeper, you're doing pretty good just to get your bees to draw out both of their brood boxes. That's probably all you're going to get the first year in at least 50% of cases. But if you're a second-year beekeeper or a pro beekeeper and have been doing it for years, and one of your objectives is to make a honey crop, then how do we make sure we make the most honey possible? There's a couple really key things I want to show you guys and discuss on tips and tricks I've found over the years for maximizing honey production. Now, one of the biggest factors is just location, and you can't get around that. I mean, if you're a small scale beekeeper, you can't do what us commercial beekeepers do and move your bees across the country or move them 5 hours away to an area where you make more honey. You're kind of locked into your local area. And in most cases, whether you're 2 miles this way or 2 miles that way isn't going to make a tremendous difference in most cases, how much honey you make. But location is huge. You're probably kind of locked into one location. As far as what to expect honey production wise in that location, visit with other local beekeepers. It can range anywhere from 30 pounds average to 200 pounds average, depending on where you are in the country. But location aside, because again, there's not a ton you can do about that, what are the factors you can control that will really ensure you make the most honey possible? Now, the number one thing after location is going to be hive strength. You aren't going to make honey if you don't have a really strong hive. You got to have a lot of foragers available to go out and forage for that nectar instead of taking care of bees, raising baby bees, cleaning the hive, etc. Your hive has to get kind of beyond a certain critical mass until before your hive's really going to put a lot of energy and effort into foraging. And so, you know, you've got to have a really strong hive. Now, if you're running just a single story brood box and everything above it is a honey super, that single box needs to be completely packed full of bees to be considered a strong hive. If you've got 2 brood boxes, 2 deeps like I have here, or a deep and a medium, 2 brood boxes, both of those boxes need to be full of bees, brood, stored honey for a hive to be really strong and ready to produce a honey crop. If your brood boxes aren't full, you're not going to make that much honey. So the trick is to time growth to reach a peak, or to have both your brood boxes full right when you're going into your main honey flow. Now, when does the honey flow start? Well, that depends. Every area is different. Again, talk to those local beekeepers to understand where in your area, when in your area the local honey flow begins, because it can range dramatically depending on what state or what area you're in. Where I live in North Texas, you know, it's very consistently the first or second week of May that we see the main primary surplus nectar or honey flow begin. But again, that can vary wildly depending on where you live. But my goal, by the time my main surplus honey flow begins, I want both of my brood boxes full of bees and brood and ready and needing that next super. I want this top box to be at least 80% full of bees, 80% drawn comb before I add my honey super and expect to make a honey crop. If these boxes aren't full, or almost completely full, you're not going to make a honey crop. So really strong bees is critical. That means you need to split as early as possible. You need to be splitting, 4 to 6 weeks before your main nectar flow begins, ideally, and maintaining a really, really strong hive to make a great honey crop. Now, another thing is feeding. Now, when I'm going through a hive, number one, let's see if this hive is ready for a honey super or not. So our top box, I love that. Inner cover, covered in bees, always a good sign. So this hive, if you can see it in the video, I'm gonna try to show you before I smoke it, because they'll all run down. This top box, pretty much completely full of bees. That's a great sign. It means that, again, the bottom box is the same. The bottom box is completely full of bees. So they are ready for a honey super as far as bee population goes. So that's good, but the downside to this hive, what I'm not seeing in this hive is much stored food. So when I lift up on this hive, it's very light. It might have 20 pounds of resources, maybe 30 at the very most. And I have a lot of empty frames food-wise in this top box. When I start looking at these frames, sorry bees, when I start looking at these frames, these outside frames have almost no stored syrup, honey, nectar, etc. This one has a little bit, but not a lot. So I've got brood, I've got a good amount of brood, I've got a good amount of bees, but they are going to have to store a tremendous amount of that new fresh nectar that they're bringing in. That's going to have to be stored in these brood boxes before they ever move that honey up into the super. So not only do I want these boxes full of bees, good bee population, great brood, but I also want them to have a lot of stored syrup in these brood boxes so that when I do put my honey super on, they're moving all that fresh nectar right up into the honey super. They're bypassing the brood box because they've already got all the food they need in the brood boxes. So I'm usually going for, about 30 pounds of stored nectar or syrup, usually, in each brood box before I add my honey super. So my goal is when the main nectar flow begins, I want boxes full of bees, a lot of brood, 8+ frames of brood, and then all these empty frames on the outside edge, I don't want them empty, I want them full of syrup. And so I'm going to be feeding fairly aggressively to achieve that so that when I do add my honey super, again, all that nectar, instead of being stored in the brood box, goes up into my super. Because where I live in North Texas, if I don't feed this hive aggressively, and they, again, our average honey crop is only 30 to 40 pounds, all that's just going to be stored in the brood nest, and I'm not going to get any honey at all. So feeding is a critical part. Queen excluders, should you use them, should you not? I addressed that in a different video. But if you have a weak hive and not a great honey flow, a queen excluder can slow down the progress of storing honey in a super. If you've got a really strong hive and a strong honey flow, the queen excluder is virtually irrelevant. The bees aren't going to notice it. They're going to move right through it. But if you live in an area where you don't have a great nectar flow, or it's a bad year for a nectar flow, and your hive is just so-so in strength, I probably wouldn't use the queen excluder because it will slow them down just a tad. The other suggestion I have for maximizing a honey crop is to always checkerboard your frames. And again, I've got other videos on how to do this, but essentially instead of putting a whole box of foundation onto this hive, which is really going to slow them down when it comes to honey production, I checkerboard frames. So this frame is brand new. It's foundation. That's a frame of foundation. This is a frame of comb from last year. So this one's already drawn out. So every other frame, I put foundation, then comb, foundation, then comb. I'm checkerboarding it. And that means that the bees will move up into this honey super much, much faster because they smell that fresh comb. They're excited, they smell that fresh comb. And they'll also draw out my foundation much, much faster too, because they're already going to be moved up into that super, eager and quick to work it. So I try to avoid putting an entire box of foundation on. I try to mix my comb and foundation together, and that speeds up the process a bit as well. So those are some of my top tips for maximizing a honey crop or maximizing honey production. The biggest focus though is bee population and stores inside your brood nest. If you get those two things right, you're probably going to make a great crop. Should you use a queen excluder? It's a great question, and one that beekeepers have been debating about for years. Some beekeepers they don't call them queen excluders, they call them honey excluders. And other beekeepers swear by them, say it's the greatest thing on the planet, and every beekeeper should use them. And when you have two parties that adamantly think so opposite, oftentimes in beekeeping anyway, the answer is you can kind of go either way. There's not a clear right or wrong. And that's very true when it comes to queen excluders. It's preference based. You don't have to use a queen excluder. It does make extracting honey a little bit easier. It keeps the queen out of your honey supers, but it can slow down honey production a bit in certain circumstances. So I'm quickly going to tell you, should you use one or not, and then how to use it. Well, and you can also get a plastic or a metal queen excluder. Doesn't really matter. The bees don't really care. The plastic ones used to kind of hurt the bees, and they used to fall apart really quickly due to UV light, but the plastic ones these days work really, really well. I kind of prefer them because they're flexible. They don't break as easily. The metal one, if one of these gets bent, these metal rods get bent, then the queen can get through. These don't last as long, but so it's either way. It depends on if you want to go premium, get the metal. If you're trying to go cheap, get the plastic. They both accomplish the same job, which is keeping the queen out of the honey super. So use whichever one you want. For the sake of the video, I'll use the yellow one because it's yellow and we're beekeepers and we love yellow. So as far as whether or not you should use one, if you have a strong hive with great bee population and it looks like it's going to be a pretty good honey flow that year, it doesn't hurt at all to use a queen excluder. It's just going to go right between your top brood box and your honey super, and it prevents the queen from getting into your honey super and laying eggs. So if you have a mediocre hive, if your hive isn't that strong and your honey flow isn't looking to be that great, then it can really slow them down from storing honey up into your honey super. So that's kind of the determination for me. I mean, if my bees look great bee population, bursting at the seams full of bees, and my nectar flow looks really good that year, sure, queen excluders are a great tool to make extracting and harvesting honey simpler. If I'm like, oh, my bees really don't look that good this year, then I'm probably not going to use a queen excluder because it'll slow them down. Now, if you get brood up in your honey supers, it's not that big of a deal. You can still, you can move the brood down into the bottom box if your honey super is a deep box. If you have several hives, you can consolidate all the frames of brood into one brood box and put it on top of a weaker hive. There's any number of ways that you can handle that brood. If you extract quickly, I mean, I've taken cap frames of brood and pulled them off with the honey super, extracted honey, put them back in that honey super and put them back on the hive. And if you do that within, 6-7 hours on a hot day, that cap brood will survive oftentimes. So plenty of ways to handle brood in the honey super. It's just inconvenient. So now, how do you use a queen excluder? Pretty simple. When you've got a hive, this is a hive that is ready for a honey super, which just means that it's full of bees, obviously. It's a great hive, full of bees. Both brood boxes are packed out with bees and honey. It's ready for a honey super. So this is really simple. You have two options, or really not, it's not really an option. There's two ways you can go here. If you have a honey super like this one that already has drawn out honeycomb, or in this case we've checkerboarded these frames. I've got drawn honeycomb from last year, and then I've got a frame of foundation, and then I've got, frame of drawn comb. So I've checkerboarded these frames. So I've already got, 50% of the super is already drawn comb. So if you've checkerboarded or your honey super is completely drawn comb, then just put on the queen excluder and put on your honey super. Simple as that. You're done. Easy peasy. Now, if your honey super is all foundation, so if this is your first year in beekeeping, and like this super, everything is just foundation, undrawn comb, then you don't want to put the queen excluder on yet, because the bees will not move through the queen excluder to draw out foundation. Now, if there's already comb up here, like in the previous super, they'll move right through and start drawing out those checkerboarded frames of foundation, but that pre-existing comb will draw them right through that queen excluder. They won't move through that queen excluder to draw out a super that has no previously drawn comb in it. So in that case, I'm just going to not use the queen excluder yet. I'm going to put this box on. I'm going to be feeding my bees probably for a couple more days so they get started drawing out this honey super more quickly. And once they've got about a fist-sized piece of comb drawn out on these middle 3 or 4 frames of foundation, then I'm going to pull off the super. I'm going to shake all the bees out because I want to make sure my queen isn't up there. Put on my queen excluder and put my honey super right back up on top. And now that the bees have gotten started drawing out that foundation, they'll continue moving through that queen excluder now that they can smell it and they've already gotten started. So it's as simple as that. By the way, one of the reasons I love this yellow, here at the Bee Supply, we made these queen excluders yellow because it's so easy to see. When you're looking at your bee yard, you can easily and quickly see, oh yeah, that one has a queen excluder, because that yellow really stands out. But yeah, simple as that. And then that queen excluder just stays on until you harvest honey. And then the queen excluders should always come off when you harvest honey, and they can stay off until you're ready to put supers on next year. Hey guys, Blake Shook here. So drawing out foundation, got to be one of the more challenging, frustrating, discouraging aspects of beekeeping. And the reason is that we're impatient as beekeepers. Usually we want bees to move it along, start drawing stuff out, and the bees don't read all the bee books. They certainly don't do what I want them to do. And so they do things when they need it and when they want to do it. And drawing out foundation is no different. When they need the space, when they are strong enough to do it, they'll do it. But it can be frustrating for us if we're trying to get them to draw out, our brood box or draw out honey supers. We want them to speed it up, move along. So there are a few tips I have for you to encourage bees to draw out comb that I've learned. But patience is a huge factor. The bees are going to do it when they need it. But there are a couple key things to watch out for. So this applies whether you're trying to get bees to draw out their second brood box or draw out their first brood box or honey supers. This hive has a honey super on it of pure foundation. So we'll look at this one. But there's a couple important things to keep in mind when you are needing bees to draw out foundation. The first one is that it takes heat for bees to draw out foundation. I'm sure you've all handled, or you may or may not have handled beeswax. When beeswax is really cold, it gets extremely brittle and crunchy. So bees really can't draw out foundation and manipulate it on the hive if they can't keep this frame warm. So they have to be able to keep it warm in order to make that wax pliable that's coming out of their abdomens and mold it onto this foundation. If the bee population isn't sufficient to keep this frame warm and warm the surface of this frame, they can't draw out wax. And really what that means is you've got to have a pretty decent bee population in order for them to draw out wax. So bee population is the #1 factor when it comes to drawing out foundation quickly. You got to have a lot of bees. So if your hive isn't very strong, they don't have a lot of bees, then they're just not going to draw it out yet. You've got to wait and let that hive grow, and they'll draw it out when they're ready. The other huge factor is food. It takes 10 to 11 pounds of honey or syrup to draw out 1 pound of wax. So bees need a lot of food to draw out these frames of foundation. If they are short on food, if they're hungry, if there's not a natural nectar flow and you're not feeding them, they're not going to draw out comb. There just aren't. It takes a lot of syrup or honey or nectar for the bees to eat to produce that wax. So they need a surplus of food in order to draw out frames. The other thing to really keep in mind is the wax clean? Is it old wax foundation? If this is a frame that's been sitting in your garage for 6 months and it's got a layer of dust over it and it no longer smells like beeswax, the bees aren't really going to draw it out. That's just a sheet of plastic to them, and they don't really want to touch it. So for me, the #1 guide is, can I smell beeswax on a frame of foundation? So, wow, that smells so good. If I can smell a frame and smell the beeswax on it, I'm good to go. If I can't smell that beeswax at all, then I'm probably going to put a light coat of beeswax on this frame, and that'll really encourage the bees to quickly move up into it. Now, you can do that by any number of ways. You can melt a little block of beeswax and brush it on lightly with a paintbrush or a little paint roller. My favorite is just to get a block of wax. We sell these. It's a little cylindrical block of wax, and you can just scrape it right over that foundation. And then put it back in your hive, and that way you don't have to worry about melting anything. You just scrape, put it in. You can even do it in the bee yard. And it puts that smell of wax back on that frame of foundation, and then the bees will move back up here and start working it. So food is big, population is huge, and then having that fresh smelling beeswax is really important. Whether you melt wax and coat the frames or scrape it on, make sure that that foundation gets back in the hive within ideally 24 hours so that it doesn't start losing that scent or losing that smell. Freshly applied and put right onto the bees is ideal. But bee population, food reserves or food feeding, and the age and smell of the foundation, those are the 3 biggest things you can control to ensure that your bees draw out foundation quickly. And if they're not doing it, they just aren't ready. So yeah, one thing I forgot. I was walking around there to turn the camera off. A really important thing to remember is queen excluders. Bees will not draw out foundation through a queen excluder. So if you've added your honey super, you can see on this hive, we've got the honey super and it's a honey super of foundation. Great bee population, by the way. We do not have the queen excluder on this hive yet. So I'm going to wait Once they draw out a fist-sized piece of comb on 3 or 4 of these frames, then I'll shake the bees out because I want to make sure the queen isn't up here, and then I'll add my queen excluder. If I add the queen excluder right now, before the bees get started drawing out the foundation, they are not going to go through this queen excluder to draw out comb. They just don't do it. So wait to add your queen excluder until the bees have started drawing out foundation, then go back and add it on. If you've got that queen excluder on, it could be one of the reasons they're not touching that foundation. Okay, now I'm really done. Now I'll turn off the camera.
All right, so there you go, guys. That is the bee yard portion for this month. Let me get us back over here to the classroom portion, and let's talk a little bit more about what you need to be doing in May. Now, Sherry used this box, I think, last month, so stole my thunder a little bit. Actually, it's a box from last year. But so what is going on when it comes to the advancement of spring throughout the country? So this is the National Phenology Network map, and this is showing out when major plants are leafing out throughout the country. And like I've talked about before, the darker the red, the earlier spring is, or the more blue, the later the spring is. And I'm going to see if I can stop it on, whoops, oh no, I skipped it. Oh, there we go. Oh, bummer. It's a looping video. And so I'm always trying to like stop it right on our current date so that we can actually see what it is at the moment, but no such luck. I've lost my little play button, so I'm not sure how to pause it. Sufficient to say, pretty early in the central United States, spring is pretty early. Parts of Texas are actually pretty late. Florida is pretty late, but you can see that central United States, pretty early spring leaf out across the whole central and eastern United States. When we jump over here to the bloom map, now this is not necessarily when your major nectar flow begins. I would say this is more similar to when your major pollen flow begins, not nectar flow. So I wouldn't rely on this to say, oh, it's red or it's advancing to my area, my nectar flow must be beginning. No, this is more of when the first plants start blooming. And so again, similar to the leaf out map, you know, the central United States is pretty early as far as blooms. And then you can see kind of once you get up to Nebraska, Iowa, it's not a lot of blooms happening yet. So anyway, so the honey flow, like I just mentioned, the bloom map tends to indicate the start of the pollen flow, not necessarily the honey flow. This doesn't apply to all regions, but I would say in general, looking at that map, the honey flow usually follows that bloom map by 2 to 3 months. So whenever that bloom hits your area, your main primary nectar flow will often hit 2 to 3 months later. So the bloom and just indicates you've got some bloom starting. But these are helpful guides, especially if you're a new beekeeper, to kind of get a feel for what's going on when. And of course, here's the infamous drought map. I feel like this is always a bit of a downer. Not too bad this year, really. I mean, it's easy to say unless you're in, you know, Montana, or you know, if some of these states, New Mexico is pretty bad. Parts of Texas are not great, but I've certainly seen this map way worse. So all things considered, this isn't a horrible drought map overall. And those of you in Southeast Texas, you're like, yeah, we would take a little bit of that yellow drought right now because it just will not stop raining. So, but keep an eye on this as the year advances. I want to do a quick poll. I'm just curious from your perspective, what you are seeing in your area. So what is the flow status? What are your hives currently doing? Are they currently storing surplus nectar or honey in your honey supers? Are they bringing in pollen but no surplus nectar yet? Or are they not bringing in anything? So curious to get your thoughts or hear what your bees are doing based on your area. Has your major nectar flow begun, or are you still just kind of stuck at pollen and nothing else coming in? So interestingly, as I'm watching your responses come in, nobody has said your bees are not bringing in anything. So everybody's got something coming in. That's great. Everybody's got pollen or nectar coming in. But the vast majority of you, about, let's see, well, about 75% of you are saying that your bees are bringing in pollen, but no surplus nectar yet. And about 25% of you are saying you are now getting surplus honey being stored in your honey super. So about 75% of you, you're seeing a good pollen flow, not a lot of nectar yet. The rest of you, 25%, are seeing some nectar being stored in your super. So we're just at the very, very, very beginning of the nectar flow for some of you. For most of us, though, the nectar flow is just right around the corner. And so what I expect to see in hives this time of year is a lot of brood. You should see a lot of brood. You know, no matter where in the country you are at this point, I mean, maybe if you're at the very, very far northern, Canadian border, then maybe you're not seeing a ton of brood yet. But really everywhere you should be seeing a lot of brood. Certainly if you're in the southern 2/3 of the United States, you should have a lot of brood at this point. Talked about it a little bit last month, but spotting eggs and larvae is just a quick refresher. Use your smartphone, go out if you have a hard time finding eggs, take a picture when that sunlight is shining directly down into those cells, and then zoom up using your smartphone. It's a way easier way to see eggs. You might look at this picture and go, well, that's not that hard to see. Well, it's because it's white, brand new white beeswax and jet black foundation that's brand new. So this is as easy as finding eggs is ever going to get in your beekeeping journey. Usually, even when you zoom back, like the pictures on the right here, it gets really hard really fast. And then this is usually what we see. This frame in that center area is full of eggs, but this is what is normal to see in a hive. The comb only stays that beautiful translucent white for like a couple weeks. And then it quickly gets darker as bees start hatching out and leaving their cocoons plastered on the outside edge of that cell. As bees walk all over the comb, it darkens very, very, very quickly. And so it's way harder to see eggs in this type of comb than that brand new comb. So taking a picture with your smartphone and zooming way in is super duper helpful. Caring for growing new hives. So a lot of you have bought bees or just split hives. I want to touch on this quickly. Oh, and I didn't. I even had it at the very beginning when I was talking about the flooding. I had a text on there that said feeding, something to do with feeding. And I had that in there to remind myself to talk about what do you do when it's flooding like this. How does that impact the need to feed? And really across a lot of the South, we are getting a lot of rains, and it can kind of slow down the honey flow. And the bees are not able to get out and forage as much. And when you kind of have these multi-day rain events, the bees, especially if they're really strong, can burn through food so fast. When I was out in the bee yard yesterday filming those videos, that was one thing that I was really struck by is a lot of those hives, the bee population was fantastic, but they were hungry. And so we needed to go in and add food to a lot of those hives because even though the bee population was great, tons of brood, they were pretty light. And so on years where you're getting a lot of these rains or you're getting flooding, you're probably gonna have to feed a little more aggressively than normal. So if you're a brand new beekeeper and have a brand new hive, usually that looks like feeding about 1 gallon of 1-to-1 syrup per week to aid in growing that hive. You don't really need pollen substitute this time of year. And then you add a second box when your first box is 80% full of bees. Now, feeding is a balancing act. If you need to make sure that there are, those middle 4 or 5 frames in the hive should have plenty of room for the queen to lay. So you don't want all the frames full of honey or syrup because then the queen doesn't have anywhere to lay. So it's kind of a balancing act. In most cases, a gallon of 1-to-1 syrup per week kind of hits the nail right on the head. for what a growing hive needs. But you need to look at your bees and make sure that there's plenty of space for the queen to lay. I did a video, I didn't show it today because it's for brand new beekeepers and a lot of you are pros, but I uploaded it to YouTube this morning or this afternoon. And it was just a video on, hey, if you're a brand new beekeeper doing your inspections, you're doing an inspection for the very first time on a brand new hive you get home, here's all the stuff you need to look at and look for. And so that's on our YouTube channel as of today, if you want to check that out. Final note, entrance reducers, if you have them on, you need to make sure they're on the largest opening. I would not install an entrance reducer this time of year unless your hive is less than a half a box full of bees. So if you just installed a package or a nook, then yeah, throw that entrance reducer on the largest opening, and it'll help prevent any chance of robbing. But if they're more than a half of a deep box full of bees, that entrance reducer is totally unnecessary. And once they get to that point of a half a box full of bees or more, you can pull that entrance reducer off. Something you might see this time of year, and you'll certainly probably see it more as summer progresses, is bearding. All of a sudden you look out at your hive and you go, oh my goodness, there's like this beard of bees hanging off the front of my hive, or maybe they're all over the front of your hive. What is going on? It could be caused by a number of issues. Humidity is one. If it's just, goodness knows we've had humidity the last couple of weeks or the last week or so across a lot of the South where I live anyway. If it's really hot, really humid, especially in the evenings, a lot of those forager bees will just come out of the hive and hang out in front to get some of the bee population out of the hive so that they cool off. It's just too hot and sticky in the hive, and so the bees will come out in the evenings. It could be an indicator that they need more space. If they get really full, you might start having beards of bees. Temperature plays the biggest role. The only time I'm concerned about it is if all the boxes on my hive are more than 80% full of bees, then they really need more space and they're at high risk of swarming. Ideally, you want to catch it before they start bearding out of the hive. But if all the boxes are not completely full, then they're probably just are hanging out to cool the hive off a little bit, and it's not a big deal. But again, if they're more than 80% full, put an extra box on them. I already said this a few times, but adding a second box or supers, I didn't do a video on when to add supers because I did that last month, and I also have 2 or 3 videos on our YouTube channel already about when to add supers. So I'll include those in the notes on this video if you want to go back and follow those links to see when to add supers. But again, general rule of thumb, anytime any box is 80% full of bees, time to add another box. So whether it's a honey super or a brood box, when your top box is 80% full of bees, time to add another box. That picture, they should have had another box 2 or 3 weeks before. So that's 100% full of bees. Yeah, once you're at that point, they really desperately need the room. When should you stop adding supers? As a general rule of thumb, I stop adding honey supers when I'm within about 10 days of the end of the honey flow. So when those major nectar producing flowers kind of start drying up, that's when you don't want to add supers. You want to let them finish filling out what they've got. And again, once you've been keeping bees a few years, you'll kind of learn when the end of the honey flow is, because it's usually within about a 10-day to 2-week span every year that it ends in most areas. So when it's not a science, but when you estimate, okay, I think we're about 10 days, 2 weeks from the end of the honey flow, that's when I stop adding supers. You can put on 2 supers at once. That's perfectly fine. If I've got a really strong hive that looks like this, and I'm still, I'm only halfway through the honey flow, yeah, I'll go out there and add 2 boxes on at a time. That way I'm not revisiting the hive quite as much. I would only do this on a really strong hive because a weaker hive just isn't going to need that much space. But a really strong, healthy hive, perfectly fine. They'll be able to keep that comb safe no matter what. So bottom supering is simply when, in this picture is a good example, I've got my 2 deep brood boxes, and then this top box is a medium box. When it's full of honey, I could add a super right onto the top, or I could add it underneath this top super. I personally just, if it's drawn comb, if my honey supers are all drawn comb, I just put it on top. It's easier. Bees don't really miss a beat. But if it's foundation, then I bottom super. I put it underneath my full super. Bees are just a lot faster to draw up foundation when it's right above the brood nest, kind of right above the heart of activity, than when it's on top of the hive. A couple other things you might see. So kind of late spring troubleshooting. These are questions we get a lot. My hive is suddenly queenless. This is really, really common, and it happens for all sorts of reasons. It's really common that queens are damaged in transit if you've just bought bees or moving bees. Even if the queen wasn't killed completely, she could have been damaged. And then the bees will supersede her a couple days later or a week later. They'll realize she's damaged and they'll kill her to replace her. Could be the hive swarmed, could be that she was damaged and killed as you were inspecting the hive, could be she was poorly mated. And that isn't always evident at first. If a queen was poorly mated, it could have been that, hey, the week that she was out mating, it was rainy and cold and windy, and maybe she didn't mate with enough drones. And sometimes that'll show up a week after, or sometimes it doesn't show up for 3 months later. Just depends on how many drones she mated with. So it could be she was poorly mated. Whatever the reason, queenless hives this time of year are no fun, but queens are also readily available. So adding a queen to a hive is no problem. If you've already got capped queen cells in your hive, I wouldn't bother adding a new queen. I would just let them finish raising their own. What I would do is add some brood from a different strong hive, assuming you've got more than one hive. You can add a frame of capped brood from a stronger hive into that weaker hive, and that'll help keep their strength up as they're finishing raising their new queen. Your bees aren't drawing out comb in your honey super. I think I've covered that at length tonight in the video, so I won't go into that one. Your bees aren't growing. This is super common too, and a lot of different reasons there could be a lot of different reasons as to why your bees just aren't growing. This is especially common for new beekeepers who just installed a package or a nook, maybe just bought a hive. And beekeeping just takes patience sometimes. If you've got brood and you're feeding your hive, sometimes you just have to wait. They have to hatch out maybe a couple generations of brood before they've got the population to really grow rapidly and be able to fill up your boxes. So especially if it's cool or really rainy or there's not a lot of flowers blooming, it just really slows down their growth. And so the big thing to watch out for, though, is making sure that you do have brood, making sure you've got a queen, and then making sure that they have enough food. Those are the two biggest things that you can do to make sure that they've got what they need to be able to grow at their own pace. And then you could say, yeah, I'm feeding them like crazy and they aren't drinking the syrup. And usually if bees need it, they'll drink it. It could be they're bringing in enough natural nectar. Couple things you can watch out for, though, is if the syrup is too thin, I wouldn't do less than 1-to-1 sugar water. But if it's less than 1-to-1, they often won't drink it. So make sure you've got enough sugar in there. And then secondarily, if you're using a feeder that the bees can't access, that's a problem. Like if you're using the entrance feeder and maybe you didn't dissolve the sugar well enough in the jar that sits on the entrance feeder, and then those sugar granules settled to the bottom of the jar and sealed off all the holes. That could happen. Or if you've got a top feeder that's assembled incorrectly, maybe the bees can't access it. So sugar to water ratio and access are the two things you need to watch out for. But if those are proper, then your bees just don't need the syrup right now. So if you are going to treat for varroa mites in the spring, then you need to do that like before your major nectar flow begins. So if you're in this, the very southern states, you pretty much miss the window to treat for varroa mites and still harvest honey. If you're further north, you do still have time. You could treat for varroa mites. If you're doing a mite test right now and your mites are 3 per 100 bees or less, you can usually wait to harvest honey in late June and still treat for varroa mites. If they're over 3 or 4 mites per 100 bees, then you can use a treatment that is acceptable with your honey supers on. So there are some treatments that are perfectly fine to do when you are producing honey, and so you can use those if they aren't as effective, but they should hold you over until you are able to harvest honey. And to see all those treatment options, because I always say, like, man, we could spend an hour talking about all the different treatment options and which ones to use and when and how. Google the Honeybee Health Coalition Varroa tool, and it'll do a quiz with you, and it'll walk you through what you can use and when. Let's see, I'm going to skip a couple of these because I want to get to honey production in just a minute. And then if we have time, I also want to do some live Q&A because this time of year, folks have lots of questions, which is awesome. Small hive beetles and wax moths. I don't really worry about wax moths this time of year. By the way, this picture, great big grubby worm, that's the wax moth, and then the smaller larva there is the small hive beetle. So wax moths are very rarely a problem this time of year. Now, I should say in a living hive. If you have stored equipment, stored honey supers, this is the time of year to worry about wax moths, because the wax moths are active as daytime or nighttime temperatures rise above freezing. Your wax moths are going to be active and they can start eating your stored honeycomb. So reapply those wax moth crystals if you're not using your honey supers already. In living hives, wax moths are typically not a problem unless your hive is basically dead. So small hive beetles, I expect to see adult small hive beetles in a hive. If I see 2, 3, 4, 5 adult small hive beetles, the black, not the larva, the black adult beetle, that's perfectly normal and very expected. If I see dozens and dozens and dozens, that's when I'm concerned. If I see larvae, if I see the small hive beetle larva, I'm concerned. I don't want to see those in a living hive, especially if they're in a frame. If they're inside the cells of a frame, that's not good. It means they're getting a foothold in the hive. And so in that case, I'm going to scrape those larvae out into some container, and then I'm going to freeze that container so I kill them. By the way, it takes a couple days in the freezer to kill small hive beetle larvae. If you just put them in there for a few hours, they'll make it. They're tough little boogers. So, and then, figure out why that hive is so weak. Now, the exception here will be if you buy nooks. Pretty much all the nook boxes, the frames in a nook box rest on the bottom of that nook box. And it's not terribly uncommon that small hive beetle larvae will be hidden underneath the frame, between the bottom of the frame and the bottom of the nook box, because there's no space. It just sits on the floor. And so the bees can't get under there to clean out these larvae. So if you see, a handful of these small hive beetle larvae on the bottom of your nook box, like when you're transferring your frames into your hive, I'm not that concerned. The bees should clean them up as soon as now they can get to them, they can get rid of them. Where I do get concerned is if it's in a hive and they're in the frame, that's an indication that they are gaining a foothold. And this is what it can look like. The picture on the left here is when they've slimed a frame. So the larvae kind of leave this slime behind as they go through eating the pollen, especially is their favorite. The picture on the right has webbing from wax moths, as well as sliming from small hive beetles. And you can see there's bees over here in this hive, but it's like 1 or 2 frames of bees. There's not enough bee population to defend themselves. So small hive beetles and wax moths are really the scavengers of the bee world. And so they don't kill hives, but when a hive becomes too weak to defend itself, they'll move in and start making a mess. But usually a hive has to be like basically dead before this happens. Okay, so we've got about 30 minutes left. And so I'm going to take about 15 minutes and I'm going to talk about optimizing honey production, because we're going into honey season, and how to make sure you make the most honey you possibly can. But I'm going to go through it fairly quickly because the video I did in the bee yard kind of hit some of the high points. Now there's some things I didn't talk about that I want to get to tonight here. But then I'm going to try to leave about 15 minutes at the end to answer any of your questions, and we'll kind of do a live Q&A. So if you have a question that you want me to answer specifically, go ahead and put it in the Q&A box and just put Blake in front of the question. And then Dodie and Sherry won't answer it, and they'll save it for when I answer some of these questions live. So let's talk about honey production. You know, in the video, I talked about location is everything, but I want to make a quick comment that urban beekeeping can sometimes make more honey and more interesting honey. Some of the urban honey I've tasted is so interesting because you never know what's being planted in an urban area. And you typically have more plants blooming at more odd times. You know, if you live way out in the country, you're kind of at the mercy of the rain, and the native plants start blooming at a certain date and stop blooming at a certain date. Versus more in urban areas, you've got people planting flower beds and plants blooming at a much wider or broader span of time. And so sometimes you can make more honey in an urban area, and you can certainly get a nectar flow and a pollen flow earlier and later in the year. So yeah, pretty interesting. Like I said in the video, you know, hive strength is everything when it comes to making honey. I mean, I would, if I had to choose today, do I want 100 mediocre hives for honey production or 10 crazy strong hives? I would put money on the fact that those 10 crazy strong hives will outproduce 100 just kind of mediocre hives. So bee population is everything. So time your splits, time your requeening, to make sure that by the start of the honey flow in your area, your boxes are completely full of bees. Now, quick little footnote I want to throw out there is when it comes to splits, I usually want to make my splits 4 to 6 weeks before my main honey flow, and that's using mated queens. So 4 to 6 weeks, and as long as you do splits with 3 frames of brood, 3 good frames of brood, a mated queen, and 4 to 6 weeks before your main honey flow, and that hive should be able to make a honey crop, assuming you're feeding and they accept that queen, no problem. Every week closer to the honey crop, to the honey flow I get, I add an extra frame of brood if I'm making splits. So if I want to make a split and the main honey flow is only 3 weeks away, I'm going to do more like 4 frames of brood. If it's only 2 weeks away, I'm going to do 5 frames of brood. If it's a week away, I'm doing 6 frames of brood and a mated queen. And that can kind of help guarantee that you actually can make a honey crop. I talked in the video about strategic feeding. Don't forget to feed your hive after you take all their honey. That's the most important time to feed. But pre-flow feeding just looks like making sure that their brood boxes are pretty much full. That way that honey or nectar they bring in goes into the honey supers, not into your brood nest. When to add those supers, man, when that top brood box is 80% full. You know, these 2 hives on the front of this picture are definitely ready for honey supers. Those back 2 aren't quite ready yet. When are the flowers blooming? So kind of getting into like how to tell when the honey flow begins. You know, for me, it's all about the flowers. So I've learned in my area what my major nectar producing flowers are. And when those start blooming, I know my honey flow begins. What are the bees doing? You know, are the bees bringing in tons of fresh nectar? Are their frames full of this shimmering fresh nectar? Are they whitening the combs? I'm going to show a picture of that in just a minute. So are your bees telling you, is the nectar flow beginning or not? Another way I can tell is when I'm out working my bees, sometimes I'll take a frame out of one of my hives that has a lot of honey on it, and I'll set it maybe 20 feet away from my hives, and then I'll go on doing my inspections. When I'm about done with my inspections, I'll go over to that frame, and if there's robber bees all over it, I know that my nectar flow really hasn't begun yet. If there's really 1 or 2 or like no robber bees all over that frame, I know the nectar flow has begun. Because once the nectar flow really begins, they're not really interested in robbing. And so that's kind of an interesting gauge to tell if the flow has begun or not. Or you can just get a little saucer and dump some honey in it from your kitchen and put it out in your bee yard and see if they're interested in it or not. What month is it? You know, it's kind of, again, I know that 1st or 2nd week of May is when my honey flow begins. So, you know, you can start learning pretty predictably when it begins. How strong are your bees? Doesn't matter how much nectar is coming in or what flowers are blooming. If your bees aren't strong enough to need another box, no point in supering. I err on the side of being a little early when it comes to adding supers. I would absolutely rather be 10 days early adding a honey super than 10 days late. Because if they're late, they're just going to pack out that brood nest with honey. And if they're going to get honey bound, the queen's going to have nowhere to lay and it's going to make a mess. So if you're unsure, it's like, I can't tell if that's 70% full of bees or 80% full of bees, just add a box. You're not going to hurt them by adding it a week or so early. We talked about that. Oh, this is what whitening up the comb looks like. So you can see where, whoops, where these arrows point. You can see that's fresh new beeswax that the bees are adding maybe to the underside of the inner cover, to the top bars of the frames. When you see this new fresh white wax being added all over the place, it means that there's a lot of fresh nectar coming in, or you're feeding really heavily. and it's a good sign. It means your hive is really healthy. They have the excess strength to be adding comb everywhere, and they've got surplus food. So that's a good sign when I see that comb being whitened, and it's an indicator that the beginning of the honey flow is upon us. Tips for drawing out comb, gonna skip it because we had a video in the bee yard about that. Checkerboarding frames, I also talked about that out in the bee yard, but just as a reminder, checkerboarding frames works great in honey supers. Do not do it in brood nests. Every year we have a couple people that buy bees from us call in and say, you know, my bees are just doing really terribly. I don't know what's going on. I did everything right. And we say, okay, send us a picture. And they'll have checkerboarded the frames in the brood nest. And so they'll have a frame of brood, then a frame of foundation, then a frame of brood, then a frame of foundation, then a frame of honey, then a frame of foundation. And that just totally breaks up the brood nest. The bees can't keep the brood warm enough at night. And you start having brood die. It's just not a good thing. So don't ever checkerboard frames in the brood nest. Always keep brood together. But in the honey super where you don't have brood, checkerboarding those frames works really, really, really well. What size of super should you use? Should you use a deep box, a medium box, a shallow box? Doesn't matter. Bees don't care. The most common super size, I would say, is a medium. A 6 5/8 medium box is the most common, but you can use whatever you want. I would say it depends on how much weight you want to lift. A deep box completely full of honey, including the weight of the woodenware, can weigh 80 pounds, so pretty heavy. A medium box can weigh 40 pounds, a shallow box 25 to 30 pounds. So it depends on how much weight you're comfortable lifting once it's full of honey, and then how much honey your area produces. You know, if your area only produces 30 to 40 pounds on average, there's no reason to be using deep boxes for supers. If you produce 100 pounds in your area, yeah, you might want a couple deep boxes if you're okay lifting that. The only other factor I consider is if I'm wanting to grow and add a lot more beehives next year, then I lean towards deep boxes for honey supers because then they're drawing out the comb that I'm going to use for splits next year. So if I'm wanting to double or triple my hive counts, then I'm using deep boxes because I need that comb next year to make successful splits. Queen excluders, we talked about those thoroughly in the video. We talked about that. We talked about bottom supering versus top supering and when to do each of those. When to harvest honey. So it's kind of the reverse of when the honey flow begins. What do the flowers say? So in my area of North Texas, when the Indian blanket and the scabiosa or pincushion start blooming, I know my honey flow is beginning. When the Indian blanket and the pincushion or Indian blanket or gaillardia, or the pincushion or scabiosa, whichever one you want to call it, when they stop blooming, I know my flow's over. So learn your flowers. That'll give you a great clue as to when the flow stops. And then what are the bees saying? You know, are they starting to uncap and eat honey in the super? Are there no exposed cells of fresh nectar? Have they eaten all that? Are they no longer whitening up the comb? Are they no longer storing nectar in your honey super? So the bees will tell you when the flow's over. How much capped honey is there? If there's most of the honey is now capped in your honey super, okay, they're probably wrapping it up. If it's all completely uncapped, then yeah, they're still in the middle of the flow. One way to tell also is a shake test, and that's where you hold a frame horizontally over the hive, like I did here on the left, and you shake it and you see if nectar rains out of it. And if the nectar does rain out of it, it's not cured, it's not ready to harvest. But if you're shaking that frame and let's say you only get 1 or 2 drips out of it, even if it's uncapped, it means it's cured. Sometimes if the flow ends really suddenly, the bees run out of energy or resources really to cap all the frames in your honey super. So a shake test is a great way to see if the honey's ready or not. This video on the right is actually in California. That would be a good example of nectar, not honey. So clearly that is just pure watery nectar, nowhere close to being ready to harvest. It's a pretty beautiful shot. And so, yeah, shake those frames. I shake them over the hive. That way, any nectar that rains out, the bees can gobble it up and reuse it. But it's a great way to tell if the flow is over and if the honey's ready to harvest or not. Finally, before we get to some of your questions, first year versus second year expectations. Really your goal for your first year is just to get your bees to draw out the brood nests. So if you've got 2 brood boxes, it might take them their whole first year just to fully draw out, fill out, finish out their 2 brood boxes. Year 2, once you've got all that comb, is when you can expect to make a honey crop. Now, I would say that about 50% of people are able to make some surplus honey in their first year, but about 50% don't. A lot of it depends on when you got your bees, whether you started with a nook, a package, or a complete hive, what the honey flow was like that year, what the weather was like that year. A lot of different factors go into it. But don't expect, oh, I just bought a brand new beehive, I'm going to make a whole bunch of honey. That's kind of year 2. Even if your beehive dies, having those brood boxes of comb will set you up incredibly well to make honey year 2. Because again, so much resources go into filling out and drawing out all the comb in those brood boxes that even if you have to rebuy bees next year, if they don't have to draw out all that comb, they can probably still make a honey crop. When to stop feeding, and this is going, I should have added this slide. I don't know why it's all the way here at the end. This should have been at the beginning. You should stop feeding sugar water when you add your first honey super. So you don't want, every year I have someone call in and be like, I made 200 pounds of honey this year. I'm like, wow, that's like crazy good for your first year. And they're like, yeah, the honey is really like pure, it's like totally clear. There's no color to it and it doesn't have any taste either. It just tastes like sugar water. I was like, did you ever stop feeding? And like, no, we fed through the whole honey flow. I was like, well, that's super cool, but you don't have honey, you have sugar water. And now, if you're just trying to draw out a bunch of honeycomb, it's not a bad strategy. If you don't care about making honey to eat, just keep adding honey super as a foundation and keep feeding your bees through the whole honey flow. It's a great way to get a lot of comb drawn out quickly. And then you've got a bunch of comb for next year. So if you don't care about making honey, but you want to grow a bunch of bees, you can do that and they will draw out a ton of comb. But if you want to make honey for human consumption, when you add that first honey super, especially if that first honey super is comb that's already drawn out, you want to completely stop feeding. Now, if your honey super is all foundation and it's not drawn out yet, I usually add the honey super and I keep feeding another 7 to 10 days until they really get started drawing out comb in my honey super, and then I stop feeding. And usually the bees will kind of recycle that syrup out of that honey super. If again, if they've only drawn out a fist-sized piece of comb on 3 or 4 frames, they'll usually recycle that syrup that got stored up in there before they actually fill it and cap it and everything. So if it's comb, I stop feeding as soon as I add the super. If it's foundation, I stop feeding 7 days or so after I add the honey super. You would want to stop feeding if your bees are becoming honey bound, or if the brood nest is completely full of syrup and you haven't added supers yet, you don't want to feed. You want to make sure that queen has space to lay. And then if both your brood boxes are at least 80% drawn comb and filled 80% with honey, brood, and pollen, you're probably safe to stop feeding as well. So, okay, wow, that was not on purpose, but that was exactly 15 minutes. So I want to spend a few minutes answering your questions. And so let me jump into the Q&A here. Sherry, yes.
I was just going to tell you, I left you some, or we left you some,
Okay,
but there's one or two that have been answered that I may pick out if you run out. Okay.
Okay.
So
Beautiful.
I'll just let you go down through them and you do it too.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. Thank you, Sherry and Dodie. One quick thing. I just glanced at the chat here, and if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box. But someone had a suggestion. Carrie had a suggestion that I thought was really good. She said that or he, I'm sorry, I don't know which, said sometimes they have good luck just spraying foundation with sugar water to encourage the bees to move up into the foundation and draw the comb. And yeah, I do recommend that. If you just lightly spray foundation with sugar water, then the bees will move up and start licking and cleaning that foundation much quicker. I need to add that in actually to my tips on drawing up comb. That it's lightly spraying with sugar water can be a great idea. So, okay. So some of your questions here. All right. So let's see. Oh, I'm on the answered questions. No wonder I was like, these look like they're answered. Okay, Roger, you said, when will you have a chance to explain the Snellgrove board for swarm prevention? Good question. Let's see if, let me see if I can get back to that one in just a second. Well, I'll try to answer it just real quick. So I'm not a big fan of the Snellgrove board for swarm prevention. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, I wish I had a picture of it. It's kind of a board with a screen in it. And you can open certain pieces of the board and close certain pieces of the board. And there are some different ways you can use it for swarm prevention. I'm going to say I'm not a fan of it in general because it kind of can trap the bees in a hive. It can essentially trap them in the hive so they can't swarm, but still provides lots of ventilation. My concern with it is that it's easy to have bees overheat when you're using it. And then it also is not great if you're in an area with small hive beetles. It tends to encourage the small hive beetles. And I just don't find it very effective because your bees, well, personally, I find they swarm anyway. The few times I've tried it, they swarm anyway, even if you're using the Snellgrove board or the double screen board. So wasn't a great answer, but I may try to add that into a future webinar where we dive into it in a little more detail. Paul, you asked for a double deep 10 frame hive with 8 to 9 frames of bees. So you've got a double deep hive with lots of bees in it. The top box is only 1/3 full of brood and honey. Could you remove the top box and put on a honey super? For any brood frames, move it down to the bottom box. Then after the honey flows over and the super is removed, put back on the top box. Absolutely. So I love that you asked this, Paul, because I think this is a really cool way to make honey if you have a mediocre hive. So if in your situation, what Paul is describing is, I've got this 2 deep hive, 2 deep boxes. The bottom box is mostly full of bees. The top box, it's got some bees and brood in it, but not much. Can you essentially consolidate all that into one box? Go get all the brood in one box, pull off that top box, and then put a honey super on and make honey in your first year, harvest the honey, and then put that deep box back on over the summer. Absolutely. It's a great way to make honey. A couple things you're going to want to do. You're going to want to use a queen excluder in that situation. So when you consolidate all the bees into the bottom box, put a queen excluder on, and then put your honey super on top. Because if you don't use a queen excluder and you just have a single brood box, the queen is going to move up into that brood box right away. So use a queen excluder. And then when you harvest honey and take that super off, put that second box, that second brood box on right away. The bees are going to overheat without it. And then you're probably going to need to feed pretty aggressively, 1-to-1 sugar water, probably once a week. for probably a month or so after you harvest honey, because you just took all their honey away, because they really need that entire bottom box just to raise brood. And so you probably aren't going to have much honey stores down there. So when you do harvest honey and you put that deep brood box back on, just feed aggressively, so that they don't get too hungry in the summer. Okay, someone says there are 40 to 60 dead bees on top of your inner cover and you can't figure out why. It happened when I had a feeder in there, but dead bees are on the top of the inner cover only. Interesting. So depending on the style of feeder that you had, it could be that bees were drowning in the feeder. It could be that they were trapped between the inner cover and the outer cover. There's really no good reason that you would have dead bees up there unless they're trapped and they couldn't get down to the lower boxes, or they drowned, or it's possible that you were having some robber bees get in up there, because you had syrup up there. So some robber bees could have been in there, and there could have been fighting going on, and that could be the result of, or that could be why there's dead bees up there. That would be the only things I could think of as to why you would have dead bees on top of the inner cover. So, you said could anything bad happen if my hive is really high, like you've got one deep and 5 medium supers? No, I mean, you can have hives tip over. They can get really top heavy. If you've got a bunch of honey and way up high on honey supers, it's a great problem. I love it if you have that problem, but they can get top heavy and tip over. If that's the case, what I do is I just make sure I've got a really sturdy hive stand that isn't wobbly at all, and then you can use a ratchet strap to kind of strap. You can actually, I've seen beekeepers, I've not done it, but I've seen plenty of beekeepers take ratchet straps and have like a stake in the ground on either side of the hive and run a ratchet strap over the hive and kind of ratchet the whole hive down to the ground. And that works pretty well to stabilize it. So let's see, Jason, all that extra comb in the second to last slide, what do you do with it since it's all over the place? So let me see what that slide was. Oh yeah, so there you go. So yeah, so like this is actually on the top bars of a hive. Now a lot of beekeepers, if you're new, would look at that and go, oh my goodness, what a mess. When I opened that hive and saw this burr comb full of honey all over the top, I was like, yes, this is like an awesome strong hive. Yeah, it's messy, but a hive has to be really strong to do that. Now they clearly needed another box. I should have put a box on it sooner. So when I see it kind of messy all over the top bars like that, after I'm done celebrating, I just use my smoker. I smoke all the bees out of it. And then it's messy, but I use my hive tool and I just scrape all that right off the top bars. You can put all that honey 30, 40 feet away from your hive and let the bees rob it out. You can eat it. If you haven't been treating for varroa mites, just eat it. But yeah, you just scrape it all off with your hive tool, and the bees will quickly clean up any drips of honey as you slice all that off. Kim, you said you were from California. I spent a lot of my life in California, so good to meet you. You say many people say that you don't need to feed in California because you have blooms most of the year. What are my thoughts? So I would say, I've done a lot of beekeeping in California. I would say it depends a ton on where in California you are, but I would say pretty much wherever you are in California, there are times of the year you need to feed. Now, there are times of year where you've got a ton of forage in California, but California is kind of like Texas in that you've got great forage and then everything dies in the summer. So if you're in like a really urban temperate area, like if you're in, maybe the San Francisco area or the Bay Area where it's pretty temperate, you might not have to feed much in the summer and fall, but you're going to need to feed in the winter. You're going to need to feed in the early spring before blooms start. So again, you might be kind of in a microclimate, tiny little area where it's not necessary. But in general, any state in the United States, California included, there are dearth periods where you do have to feed. So I would say you're going to have to, unfortunately, get to know your local area and then make that determination. Mike, you said, what do you do with the frames of comb once you extract the honey? How do you store them, etc.? So once you've extracted honey out of your comb, what I usually do is I put them back on the hive for about 24 hours. Now, through the summer, I want all my hives to be at least 2 boxes. So if you already had 2 brood boxes, it's fine to leave them over the summer, just 2 boxes. Sometimes I put a third box, maybe a honey super back on throughout the summer just to give them a bit of a barrier from the heat. So you can put one honey super back on and just leave it on through the summer so they get a heat barrier and then pull it off in the fall. Or you can just not, if you've got 2 brood boxes, then all of your honey supers after they're extracted can be stored, and you're just going to store them in wax moth crystals, and your garage is fine. So you can put all your supers in a black trash bag and put a handful of wax moth crystals in the black trash bag, and that'll keep the wax moths out. You can freeze those honey supers and then seal them up really well. We call it a super bag, and it's an airtight bag that you can put like 5 or 6 honey supers in and seal it up so no pests can get in it. So you can store it in there. There's any number of ways you can store that comb once you've extracted honey out of that honeycomb. Gloria, you said, how many drone cells are too much? So with drones, I actually did a video on this last month. So if you go to our YouTube channel and search drones, I did a video and kind of showed this out in the BR. That might be helpful. But 10% of the bees in a hive and 10% of brood in a hive, I would expect to be drones. So 10% of the brood, no problem. Where I get concerned when it comes to drone brood is when it's mixed together with my worker bee brood. I don't want to see a drone cell, a worker cell, a drone cell, a worker cell all mixed together. I want to see, okay, here's a patch of drone brood, and then all of this is worker bee brood. That's okay. So when I see the drone brood kind of consolidated all together in various places throughout the hive, that's pretty normal. But when it's mixed completely with my worker bee brood, that means I've got a failing queen. Nancy, would putting the queen excluder on the bottom prevent swarms? Great question. So if you got a hive that's getting ready to swarm, could you put that queen excluder between the bottom board and the bottom box so the queen can't escape? Will it prevent swarms? No, unfortunately not. So what I usually find happens in those cases is the queen finds a crack between the boxes or a crack between the lid and escapes anyway. I've seen the hive swarm anyway. Once the virgin queen hatches out, sometimes the virgin queen can fit through a queen excluder. And so sometimes the hive will just wait till a virgin queen hatches and then they'll swarm with the virgin queen. And oftentimes that virgin queen will kill the old queen because a virgin queen usually can beat an older queen, and then they might swarm with the virgin queen, and now the hive's left with no queen at all because the hive just left with their virgin. Or sometimes that virgin hatches out and kills the old queen and they're all still trapped in the hive. So in general, no, I don't usually see it being very successful, unfortunately, but it's a good idea for sure. Diane, what temperature range do you remove the bottom on the screen bottom board? So if you've got a screen bottom board and it's got a cover on it, when do you remove that cover to expose that screen? I would say once nighttime temperatures are no longer dipping into freezing temperatures, it's fine to pull it off. Once daytime temperatures are, in the 50s and 60s, it's fine to go ahead and remove it, and night times are above freezing. Dale, you said, if you stop feeding within hive feeders, should you remove the feeder, empty it, or replace it with frames? Great question. So if I'm using the internal division board feeder, I leave it in there year round because I never know when I might need to feed. And if you've got 2 brood boxes, that's plenty of room for the bees, even if, one of the frames is taken up by a feeder. So the internal division board feeder, I leave it in year round. The bees don't need the space, and that way I've got a feeder that I can feed anytime. Andrew, let's see. Thank you for the kind words. You're very welcome. Andrew went from 2 hives 1 year ago to 7. That's a rapid growth rate. Congratulations. You did that by swarms and splits. The white capped honey on 3 or 4 frames and a couple of hives. Oh, you're seeing the white brand new comb on 3 or 4 frames. So that's super exciting. That wasn't actually a question. You were just being nice. So thank you, Andrew. Andrew said very nice things about me that I'm too shy to read. So thank you, Andrew. Very kind. Kenny, you said you were thinking of splitting a few hives after the July harvest, doing a walkaway split. What are my thoughts? You had 10 hives and lost 6 this January and February. 2 died, and then 4 just disappeared, even though they had stores. So 10 hives, losing 6, you're not that far off from average annual loss rate, unfortunately. And I'm so sorry, but that's pretty common. As a general rule of thumb, here's what I found. And I believe me, I have tried this so many ways and so many different methods. No matter what I do, I have not ever been able to do better than a 50% survival rate on splits after the 4th of July. So anywhere in the country, I've tried it up in the northern United States, I've tried it in California, I've tried it in Texas, I've tried it all over the place. And just in general, the exception might be Florida, where you can get away with doing splits later pretty successfully. But with the exception of Florida, splits after the 4th of July, usually you have about a 50% success rate. And then if you do a walkaway split, it's even worse, because a lot of the bees, and certainly in the southern United States, they're kicking out all the drones because you've got such a bad summer dearth. And so you're probably going to have potentially a poorly mated queen if you're doing a walkaway split that time of year. So I wouldn't do a walkaway split in the summer, and I would try to make splits before the 4th of July. Now, I've certainly done splits in the summer, and if you're okay with a 50% loss rate, you can do it. I mean, sometimes the math works, and it's still okay to do it. I would expect that higher loss rate. Now, if you split before the 4th of July, so maybe you pull honey late June and then do your splits, they can be a little more successful. The key is I would use mated queens. I would feed a week before you make the split and feed a few weeks after you make the split. And then I would make sure you use a minimum of 4 frames of brood if you're doing that summer split. So I've got a whole class, and we'll talk. I don't want to promise something I can't offer. We'll try to talk about this next month, perhaps. But if you go to our website, we do have a whole class under advanced classes on how to do summer splits successfully. So you might want to check that out. Okay, how much honey should you leave if you don't want to feed? So I'm going to assume you're talking about feeding over the winter. If you don't want to feed, it just depends on where in the U.S. you are. I would say if you're in the southern half of the United States, you're going to want to leave probably 40 to 50 pounds in your second box. So kind of ignore what's in the first brood box. So leave 40 to 50 pounds of honey in your second brood box or your super. If you're in the northern half of the United States, and again, this is painting with a pretty broad brush, you're going to want to leave roughly twice that amount. So more like 60 to 80 pounds if you don't want to feed. So a lot, a lot. And that's, it's tough to make honey and not feed your bees in most areas of the United States. Now, if you're in an area that has 100-pound crops or 100-pound plus crops, then you can kind of get away with that. You can leave enough and harvest some. In my operation, I mean, commercially, we often we go in the summertime, we bring our bees in North Dakota, and they make, they can make 150-pound crops up there. So we're actually able to leave a box of honey on them. Our second box we don't harvest honey out of, and they can have 40, 50, 60 pounds of honey in there, but it's in an area that makes a ton of honey. So yeah, great questions, guys. Thank you so much. And I would say if you have more questions, certainly keep putting them in the Q&A. We're happy to answer them, but because it is slightly past time, I'm going to go ahead and call it a night. And then we will, of course, be emailing out everything to you guys. And then, of course, we'll also be putting all the information on our YouTube channel. And then if you look it down in the description, if you're watching this, most of you watch this streamed on YouTube after the fact, check out the comments section down below. And then I'll link to a lot of stuff we talked about. So I'll link to other videos, I'll link to products we talked about, etc. So you can use that as a resource. But thank you for spending some time with us. Thanks for your attention. Happy May. And I cannot wait to see all of you in June. So don't stay too dry, but don't stay too wet. For those of you that are flooding, stay safe. And I will see you all in a month. Have a great day, everyone.